All right, one of the most important parts of swimming, obviously, to move yourself forward is the underwater arm movement. And it's important to have a basic understanding of the arm movement underwater, as this will really help you to create more drive in your stroke. There's usually three types of swimmers. So some swimmers will perceive that if they use brute strength to is the best option to drive themselves forward, which isn't really an efficient way of swimming. And usually these types of swimmers will fatigue quickly and therefore revert to a technique that doesn't or isn't as helpful to drive them forward throughout the stroke. And then the other types of swimmers will be quite slow and precise in their arm movements, and they'll really struggle to get any drive from their arms just because their movement patterns are just too slow. And then obviously there's the optimal swimming technique where swimmers are in a nice position and creating consistent pressure on the water throughout their whole stroke. And I use that analogy of trying to push a car. And if you're starting to push a car from a standstill, then it's really quite difficult to do that to get it started. But once it's actually moving, then it's relatively easy. So when we think about swimming, if we can create nice, consistent pressure on the water, then it's much easier to keep yourself moving forward with momentum rather than having to, restart moving your movement forward from a dead spot every time you take a stroke. So creating this arm movement is an important part of your swimming. So all these types of swimmers are going to benefit from learning how to create that good pressure on the water. And the drills that I use are really a basic understanding of the arm movement underwater. And these are developed in a little bit more detail throughout the process of your swimming development. But this is really just a starting point for your swimming development and creating that pressure on the water. So the options that I will often use are the double arm catch. So that's obviously understanding how to use both arms or using both arms at the same time. We're relatively balanced when we're doing this. The limitation to this drill is obviously we're not really utilizing our kick and body rotation to connect with the stroke. Whereas when we use a single arm stroke with either a kickboard or no kickboard, using pedals or fins to help us with this arm movement, then we're starting to develop a better understanding of the movement pattern that we need for our freestyle. So some of the important things around swimming and this arm movement pattern is that we have to separate your arm into two parts. The hand and forearm is one part. The bicep, tricep, and shoulder is the second part. Okay, and I look at the hand and forearm obviously as the driver of the pressure on the water to help you to go forward. And think about the utilization of the tricep, bicep, and shoulder to support the drive of the hand and forearm. Whereas most people will utilize those more dominant muscles around the shoulder, the tricep and bicep to really pull the hand and forearm through the stroke. Whereas I believe that you can create a more subtle pressure on the water that will get more out of it, which isn't quite as fatiguing. When you first put that pressure on the water, you've got to use soft hands. So when you're trying to move that water, you need to be firm but not tense. So that hand and forearm, I use the again analogy of shaking your hand. You're not going for a death grip. You're just looking for a firm pressure on the water. The next stage is that you need to anchor your hand and forearm into the water and roll your elbow forward. And if you want to do an example of this, you could place your hand on a lane rope. And firstly, so you're lying flat on the water, you've got your hands on the lane rope. Then pop your elbows up and then leverage yourself forward and then over the lane rope. And that's kind of the idea of anchoring. Then your hand and forearm are moved to about a 45-degree with very little movement of your elbow down or backwards. And this is, I think, where a lot of swimmers go wrong, is that their elbow swings around to the side or they pull their elbow back. Okay, you've got to try and keep your elbow relatively stationary when you start this movement. I'll say more flexible or elite swimmers will have that elbow position quite high in the water, but for most of us when we're swimming, that's generally not achievable. So having that elbow below the surface of the water is absolutely fine, and you'll probably find that you'll get a better pressure on the water if you do that, and it won't be quite as as hard, whereas somebody with a lot of flexibility might be able to create that, have that position a little bit higher. So EVF, or the early vertical forearm, requires a high elbow position, but still requires some depth of the stroke. Just remember, you try to keep your shoulder close to your cheek at the start of the catch. So try not to let that shoulder run away from you. You're trying to keep that relatively close up here as you initiate that catch phase. Then, under the water, your hand and forearm moves slowly forward and down to an angle of about 45 degrees, and then it accelerates to the back of the stroke. And this is why you're keeping this high elbow. So what this high elbow kind of means, it doesn't mean that the elbow stays close to the surface of the water. It's more indicating that the elbow is not driving through the or not pulling through the water, and the elbow is staying sort of forward of the hand and forearm as it drives through the back of the stroke. So even remember, at the deepest part of the stroke, our angle of our arm down is still at about 100 to 120 degrees. It's not 180 degrees, which is a completely straight arm, or it's not at 90 degrees. Okay, so which is a very bent arm. You're still looking for a strong position to be able to drive yourself forward, and that requires a slight bend in your arm, which is around about that 100 to 120 degrees. Remember, width is really important when you do this. If you come too close to your center line, you're going to find that this is really hard to do. And if you're way too wide, again, you're going to find this a little bit hard to do as well. So as you get into your swimming, and whether you're swimming and practicing some of the early drills around body rotation, or you're just starting to focus on this underwater arm movement, just start to slowly think about these movement patterns. Okay, breaking your arm in two is very important. Okay, so that hand and forearm movement, sort of being separate to the bicep and tricep. Okay, there's two parts to the arm. Okay, and we're wanting to utilize that hand and forearm to create that pressure on the water. All right, good luck with your swimming. Any questions? Remember, just reach out to us. Thanks.